Number 10. Ethel Rogers Mulvaney. During World War II, an estimated 80,000 women and children were taken by Japanese soldiers and placed in camps in the Far East. Many of the women who became prisoners of war were wives or daughters of important diplomats, and one of these unfortunate victims was a woman named Ethel Rogers Mulvaney. Ethel grew up in Canada, and she became a teacher while she was still a teenager. She then moved to Toronto, where she worked as the director of an art and literature society, and in 1933, her work sent her to Asia for an educational survey. That was where she met Dennis Mulvaney, a British Army doctor whom she married in India, and in 1940, she went with her husband to Singapore, where she volunteered as an aid worker with the Australian Red Cross. Then, in December 1941, the Japanese invaded. With the fall of Singapore, Ethel and roughly 1,000 other women were taken captive at the Changi prison. It was a complex designed by the British colonial authorities to hold a maximum of 600 people, but it held about double as many as it was supposed to. While there, Ethel did her best to uphold morale. She taught the other women how to imagine that they were somewhere else, dressed in fancy clothes while feasting on scrumptious dishes. This exercise can help survival by stimulating saliva glands to make hunger pains go away. She also encouraged the other women to create quilts, and many of these quilts, which were donated to POW hospitals, are currently held in various museums throughout the UK and Australia. Amazingly, Ethel survived the brutality of the prison. After the war, she went back to Canada and wrote a cookbook based on nearly 800 recipes she'd collected from women at their fake tea parties while in prison. And with the sales from her cookbook, she was able to raise $18,000 for former prisoners of war. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. Big thank you to Juan Castillo 1457 for the super thanks and for supporting this channel. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos like these. Number 9. The Night Witches. The Night Witches of World War II were some of the bravest women in history. They flew by night using plywood biplanes, and they survived bullets and frostbite, as well as harassment from their peers. The Nazis hated the women pilots so fiercely that any German airman who killed a night witch was automatically given the Iron Cross medal. The Night Witches were part of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and all of them were females. Throughout World War II, they dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on the Nazis. And they were called the Night Witches because of the noise their wooden airplanes would make while swooping over the ground, as it reminded the Germans of the sound a broom makes. That whooshing sound was the only warning the Germans had before the bombs started falling. Because they used bare plywood planes, they never showed up on radar or infrared. They didn't use radios either, making the women pilots essentially ghosts. The first mission of the Night Witches was on June 28, 1942. They successfully bombed the headquarters of invading Nazi forces on the Eastern Front. Up until this point in the war, the Soviet Union hadn't allowed women to fight. But with Adolf Hitler launching Operation Barbarossa and invading Russia, the Soviets finally gave in. With the help of Marina Raskova, the first female navigator in the Soviet Air Force, the Night Witches were unleashed upon the Nazi scourge, and Stalin signaled off on it himself in October of 1941. Most of the female pilots were between 17 and 26 years old. They moved to a small town called Engels near Stalingrad to train at the School of Aviation there. They were mercilessly harassed by the men, but still became one of the most important squadrons in the Soviet fight against the Nazis. And even though they had terrible equipment from the 1920s, they spent long nights stealthily bombing the Germans. They proved beyond any doubt that women are just as useful when it comes to wartime as men. The last flight of the Night Witches took place on May 4, 1945, and just 3 days later, Germany surrendered. The Germans were so baffled by how the Night Witches had caused such significant damage that they made up rumors. The Germans claimed that the women had been given secret injections that allowed them to see through total darkness. But it was really their skill and ability to work as a team that gave them their edge. And altogether, the Night Witches only lost 30 pilots out of 30,000 missions. Number 8. Noor Inayat Khan. Noor Unnisa Inayat Khan was born in Moscow on January 1st, 1914. Her mother was American and her father was Indian, but he wasn't just any Indian though. He was a descendant of Tipu Sultan, the legendary ruler of South India's kingdom of Mysore. Her mother was a poet who'd met Noor's father while he traveled through the US, and together they had 4 children, with Noor being the oldest. When she was only a baby, World War I broke out. So the whole family picked up and left Moscow, relocating to London. Then 2 years after the war was finished, the family moved to France. Noor's father passed away when she was 13, and as a young woman, she pursued a career as a children's writer. She'd just published a book called 20 Jataka Tales in London before the Second World War broke out. The global conflict interrupted her career and ultimately changed her life forever. Noor moved back to London in 1940. She wanted to contribute to the war effort, so she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and became a wireless operator. Then she was assigned to Bomber Training School and later became the first female to receive specialist training as a wireless operator. In other words, she was made into a British spy. Noor arrived in France in June 1943. At the time, the Gestapo was busy unraveling the secret network of communication that had been set up by the French resistance. Noor established herself in a Paris safe house and worked as the only agent in transmission in the city. But the Gestapo were closing in, pursuing her relentlessly. Then 1 month before she was to travel back to England, she was betrayed by a French woman and was captured by the Nazis. Noor was taken in chains to the Pforzheim Prison, and while there, the Nazis tortured her mercilessly. But even through the beatings, Noor never gave sensitive information to the Gestapo. In 1944, on September 11th, Noor was transferred to the Dachau concentration camp. And unfortunately, she'd only survived 2 days before she and her other comrades in the resistance were disposed of. Her life was tragically cut short, but her bravery played an important part in the war effort. Noor Unnisa Inayat Khan currently has a plaque in honor of her memory at the Memorial Hall in Dachau. Number 7. Krystyna Skarbek. Krystyna Skarbek was a Polish secret agent working for the British Special Operations Executive Group in World War II. She showed unimaginable bravery countless times as she risked her neck trying to get the Nazis out of Europe. Her young life was one of privilege. She was brought up in a wealthy upper-class family, spending most of her time at an estate in the country. She learned to ride horses and shoot guns, and was known all around as a great beauty. In fact, she gained a reputation for being the most glamorous spy in British history. In 1938, Krystyna married Jerzy Grzicki, and while the young couple were in Ethiopia with Jerzy working at the Polish consulate in Addis Ababa, Germany invaded Poland. The couple then immediately went to London, where Krystyna offered her services as a spy. She arranged a meeting with George Taylor from MI6 and proposed a mission. She traveled to Budapest and produced propaganda, then ski across the mountains and into Poland. And there, she'd establish lines of communication. It was an extremely elaborate plan that many of the men she worked with were skeptical about. But still, George Taylor was confident in her craftiness and wit, so she was recruited as one of the first women spies of the war. Krystyna traveled with fellow agent Andrzej Kawerski, and the two of them had an instant connection and began an affair. This, however, would lead to the termination of her marriage with Jerzy. Nevertheless, she made it across the border into Poland on a pair of skis to try saving her mother. Sadly, though, she failed. Her mother was later taken by the Nazis and was never heard of again. She continued to bring correspondence across the border of Poland and Hungary until she and Andrzej were discovered by the Gestapo in January 1941. When questioned, Krystyna bit her tongue so hard that she had blood in her mouth, making the Nazis think she was suffering from tuberculosis. The Nazis didn't even bother to keep her, and she was released under the suspicion of being extremely contagious. Krystyna was a great spy throughout the entire war. It was only after the conflict that her life fell apart. She lived in a relief house and couldn't find work. She ended up as a housekeeper, then worked as a stewardess on a cruise ship. And it was during this chapter of her life that one of her co-workers, a man named Dennis Muldowney, became obsessed with her. But when Krystyna denied his advances, he stabbed her in the chest on June 15, 1952. Dennis was found guilty of murder, and he was hanged just 10 weeks later. Number 6. The Angels of Bataan. A group of 77 nurses from the American Army and Navy were captured by the Japanese in 1942. But amazingly, every last captured woman survived their 3 years of brutal imprisonment. They stuck together through starvation and fear, and they also struggled through illness, all while continuing to work as a nursing unit. They became known as the Angels of Bataan, using their skills to take care of thousands of other prisoners. Historian Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Cantrell said they were a tough bunch. They were surviving for the boys and each other. When the nurses were first stationed in the Philippines early on in World War II, it seemed almost like a vacation. They were in a tropical paradise with light duties and tons of free time. Nurses could even dine and date, and they spent many of their days golfing, so no one ever really expected that they'd see combat. But then came the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941. That evening, Japanese planes began to bomb Manila, and that was when, for the first time, the nurses saw serious combat injuries. Manila fell, and the nurses were evacuated to Bataan. There, they set up a pair of hospitals in the jungle, the first open-air wards to be used since the Civil War. But people began to get infected with dysentery and malaria. It was a total nightmare. Then, in April 1942, Bataan fell and the Allies surrendered the Philippines to the Japanese army. And until the end of the war, these 77 nurses were kept prisoner. There was such little food that they ate weeds and flowers and cooked slugs just to survive. They were finally liberated, though, on February 3, 1945, and by then, most of the nurses had lost up to 30% of their body weight and were on the verge of starvation. If World War III started tomorrow, how many women do you think would sign up to serve in the military, whether that be on the front lines or as a nurse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. Now on to number 5. Number 5. Reba Whittle. Reba Whittle was interested in joining the Army Nurse Corps way before the US entered World War II. She graduated from college and studied at a specialty nursing school in San Antonio, and later in June of 1941, Reba became Second Lieutenant Whittle. She performed her duties stateside up until becoming a flight nurse in 1943. Flight nurses had the job of prepping and caring for wounded soldiers loaded onto departing aircraft. There weren't any doctors on board these flights, so nurses had to do everything they could to keep the patients alive. And by January 1944, Reba Whittle was flying troops from the front lines of Europe back to the English countryside to be cared for. Impressively, she went on over 40 missions between January and September 1944. Then Reba became the only female American POW in Europe during the war. On September 27, 1944, her aircraft flew off course in Germany and was shot down. Reba was wounded but miraculously survived, only to be captured by German soldiers. Oddly enough, though, German soldiers didn't know what to do with an American female prisoner, so she was transferred to a hospital at the Nazi POW camp Stalag 9C. And there the Nazis utilized Reba's nursing skills. Reba spent her time in the POW camp tending to the wounds of anyone and everyone. She was released in January 1945 and received the prestigious Purple Heart, along with an Air Medal. She lived a long and healthy life, although she did suffer from headaches up until her death as a result of the plane crash. Number 4. The women of the Soviet Union. The Germans didn't believe women had any role to play in physical combat. The Nazis only used women for secondary duties. They could drive cars or guard prison camps or hold administrative roles. But on the other hand, Russia sent 800,000 women into battle by the end of World War II, and they may not have if it hadn't been for Hitler's grand plan to occupy every last piece of grass in Europe. He invaded Russia on June 22, 1941, and the Germans were surprised when they found women on the other end of the trenches. The Nazi army continued to capture women soldiers. Then Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge ordered that any women soldiers who were captured be shot dead immediately. It was an illegal order and was quickly rescinded. But that didn't stop individual commanders from passing on orders to shoot all female POWs. These orders weren't officially issued by the Gestapo or the SS, though. Military experts say it was the generals, the top guys in the German army, who gave their own soldiers such vicious orders. There was an accepted agreement among Nazi ranks that Russian prisoners were better off dead, and that was doubly true for women prisoners. Out of the 6 million prisoners captured on the Eastern Front by Germany, roughly half of them died. Most of them were left to starve to death, and many of the women who were captured and avoided being immediately shot simply wasted away alongside their comrades. The Nazis treated Soviet soldiers, male or female, with the same careless disregard. Number 3. Gertrude Sanford. Gertrude Sanford was an American woman who spent much of the 1930s embarking on grueling hunting expeditions through Africa and Asia. While the strong men beside her collapsed from exhaustion, Gertrude kept on marching through the most inhospitable terrain. And when the US joined World War II, Gertrude took a job routing cables at the OSS Secret Intelligence Branch. But what she really wanted was to join her husband in Hawaii, where he worked for the Navy. Unable to convince her superiors to allow her to relocate to Hawaii, Gertrude was instead transferred to London. There she continued to handle cables for the Office of Strategic Services. What she hadn't expected, though, was that London was constantly being bombed. Gertrude was an interesting woman in that she was constantly trying to go somewhere and do something. She couldn't stand working in the US during the war because it was boring. She also hated working in London because the bombings meant she was stuck underground, trying not to be blown to bits. After D-Day, she contacted an American friend and tried to rent an apartment in Paris. She was already anticipating the liberation in November 1943. Then, in September 1944, she joined the new OSS office in Paris, where she began to manage communications. But what she really wanted at that point was to witness the US Army marching on the front lines. Gertrude was so desperate for adventure, she went on an unauthorized trip to the front lines near Luxembourg, where she was pinned down by German sniper fire. Gertrude had gotten exactly what she wanted, and it made her a prisoner of war for 6 months. She narrowly escaped death while being transported on a train to Switzerland. The train was about to stop when she jumped off and ran away with the German guards shouting after her. It was a harrowing escape, but it gave Gertrude the sense of adventure she was looking for. She would later return to a life of travel and exploration after the war, and in America, she lived outside Charleston until the age of 97. Number 2. Irma Grieser. Irma Grieser wasn't a prisoner of war. She was a Nazi, a volunteer member of the SS. She worked as a guard at 2 separate Nazi concentration camps, Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. And Irma, whose full name is Irmgard Ilse Ida Grieser, was the warden of the women's section at Bergen-Belsen. Irma was only a teenager when the war broke out. She was born in 1923 to a pair of dairy workers, and in 1936, her mother drank hydrochloric acid and died. This was following the revelation of her husband's affair with the daughter of a local pub owner. Historian Peter Vronsky once speculated that Irma's father likely joined the Nazi Party in 1937, then was remarried by 1939. Irma experienced an extraordinarily difficult childhood. She ran away at the age of 15 and left school. Then she worked on a farm for a few months before arriving at a hospital run by the SS. She got involved with the SS female helpers near Ravensbrück, where the Nazis were running a women-only concentration camp. And in 1940, with the war started and Hitler's final solution being carried out, Irma became an overseer. Her father was furious as he'd already opposed her joining the SS. She was then kicked out of the house, leaving her with nowhere to go and nothing to do but work. So she poured all of her energy into Nazi atrocities. Irma was one of the people who selected which prisoners would be sent to the gas chambers upon their arrival at the Auschwitz camp. But then, on April 17, 1945, Irma was captured by the British Army. She was one of the few SS personnel at Bergen-Belsen who'd refused to leave. She hadn't fled with the rest of the Nazis, allowing herself to be captured by the Allies. At the infamous Belsen trial that was held in Lower Saxony in 1945, Irma was one of the 45 people accused of war crimes. At just 22 years old, Irma was accused of murdering the people imprisoned at the camps and treating them inhumanely, and survivors provided testimonies of just how cruel Irma had been to them. The very same women Irma had tortured were the ones who spoke out at her trial. Many of them claimed she had a special whip that she'd lash them with. Irma may have had a difficult childhood and a rough time as a teenager, but the testimonies made it clear that she derived power and joy from treating the prisoners with contempt. Justice was served, though, on December 13, 1945, when Irma Grieser was taken to the gallows. There, she and the other women involved in the inhuman atrocities of the Nazis were executed one by one. The night before the execution, Irma stayed awake until the early hours of the morning, singing Nazi songs with Johanna Bormann, who was also hung at the gallows. Number 1. The Fount of Life. While women from the Soviet Union were flying dangerous bombing missions and British spies were establishing communication networks, German women were having babies. But they didn't really have a choice. In 1935, the Lebensborn program was established to promote the growth of Germany's Aryan population. Lebensborn means fount of life, and the idea was to establish a new generation of soldiers descended from the people Adolf Hitler saw as racially important. Men of the SS were encouraged to continuously get their wives pregnant, but that wasn't all. The Third Reich also tried to abolish the stigma that women suffered when having a baby out of wedlock. So the Nazis essentially encouraged women to have as many children as possible. The thing about Germany is that they were decimated by World War I. Their losses were enormous, leaving them with way less people to fight than they would have liked. Even if the babies needed to grow for 18 years, it was still better to get them growing now as opposed to later. Many women in Nazi Germany worked in factories and as medical professionals, but they were often viewed as nothing more than baby incubators. The poorest people in Germany were encouraged to have babies to create soldiers, but the Lebensborn program was something altogether different. The organizers took the most attractive girls they could find with the highest intelligence levels and had them breed with men who were socially elite. One of the men behind this scheme was Albert Speer, the legendary architect of the Third Reich. Encouraging Germans to breed was a huge success, and by 1936 the Hitler Youth Program had 5.4 million members between the ages of 10 and 18. These were youngsters who could, upon coming of age, be immediately assimilated into the Nazi war machine. Do you think World War II may have ended differently if Hitler had allowed women to fight like the Soviets had? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.